Welcome to the sleepy universe. Settle in. Get comfortable and let this journey guide you to rest. Pride and Prejudice, rewritten adaptation. Adapted from the original by Jane Austen. Chapter 1. It was a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man might be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth was so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he was considered the rightful property of one or other of their daughters, almost from the moment he arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet lived at Longbourn, a comfortable house in the countryside of Hertfordshire, where they had resided for many years. Their household was a large one. They had 5 daughters, all of them young, and of very different temperaments. The eldest, Jane, was gentle and kind, with a sweet disposition that made her beloved by everyone who knew her. Next came Elizabeth, or Lizzie, as she was often called, clever and lively, with a quick wit and a sparkle in her eye that made her stand out wherever she went. Then came Mary, who was serious and fond of reading, Catherine, who was easily led and rather giddy, and Lydia, the youngest, who was bold, high-spirited, and never without something to say. Mrs. Bennet's greatest ambition in life was to see all 5 of her daughters happily married to men of good fortune. It was, in truth, the business of her life. Any mention of a handsome bachelor or a wealthy gentleman was enough to set her mind racing, and her tongue running at full speed. Her husband, Mr. Bennet, was a man of quiet humor and sharp understanding. He found his wife's concerns often rather amusing, and was fond of teasing her, though he always treated her with good nature beneath his gentle mockery. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his wife one morning, as they sat together at the breakfast table, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," said she. "Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet took up his newspaper. "And who is it that has taken the house?" he asked, lazily. "A single man, my dear. A wealthy young man from the north of England. His name is Mr. Bingley. He is said to be very rich, and he is coming down with his family and friends next week. He has servants, horses, everything one could wish for, and he is unmarried." Mrs. Bennet's eyes grew wide with excitement. "Only think of it, Mr. Bennet! A young man of such consequence, coming to live so close to us! And he is single! It is exactly the sort of thing we have been hoping for. You must go and visit him immediately. You know you must, for if you do not call upon him first, I cannot take the girls, and we shall never be invited to his parties." Mr. Bennet smiled. "I see no reason to call upon him," he said. "You and the girls may go without me, or indeed, you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." "My dear, you flatter me," replied Mrs. Bennet. "I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When one has 5 grown daughters, one has no right to think much of one's own appearance. All the same, I do not see why we should call," said he. "He may be very glad to see us, for all that. But it is not our custom to visit every newcomer. You have a great deal of good looks and good nature to bestow, and I dare say Mr. Bingley will like you very well without my help. But think of our daughters," she cried. "Only think what an excellent match it would be for any of them. That is all I have in mind. I beg you will go and see him, for indeed I cannot endure that we should be the only family in the neighborhood not to wait upon him." So persistent was she, and so earnest in her entreaties, that at last Mr. Bennet, who was not really disinclined to oblige her, beneath his teasing, gave way. He agreed to pay a call upon Mr. Bingley as soon as he arrived. And having promised this, he listened to her with great patience while she spoke of how handsome he was said to be, and how many thousands a year he possessed, and what a fine thing it would be to have him for a son-in-law. In truth, Mr. Bennet had already made up his mind to visit Mr. Bingley. He had seen enough of his wife's anxieties to know that peace would be restored only when he had done so. Privately, he was also curious to see the young man who had caused such a stir in the neighborhood before he had even unpacked his trunks. A few days later, Mr. Bingley arrived at Netherfield Park. He was attended by his 2 sisters, and the husband of the eldest, and a young man by the name of Mr. Darcy. The party was a large one, and very fine. At the first public assembly in the town hall, the whole neighborhood gathered to see them. Mr. Bingley was soon the center of attention. He was young, handsome, and remarkably agreeable. He danced every dance, was lively and cheerful, and spoke to everyone with great courtesy. His sisters, too, were elegant and fashionable women who carried themselves with great composure, though there was a certain air of pride about them that some people did not much like. But it was Mr. Darcy who drew all eyes after the first hour. He was tall, distinguished-looking, and remarkably handsome. His income was said to be nearly double that of Mr. Bingley, a truly great fortune. Everyone admired him, and for half the evening they looked at him with great respect. But then the whispers began. He was proud, they said. He held himself too high. He did not speak to anyone outside his own party. He danced only twice, and with ladies from his own group. When Mr. Bingley urged him to dance, and offered to introduce him to any lady in the room, Mr. Darcy looked across at the Bennet girls, and Elizabeth, who happened to be standing nearby, heard him say, "She is tolerable, I suppose, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Elizabeth did not say a word. But she heard him clearly, and she felt a sudden flush rise in her cheeks. She turned away, but she could not help repeating his words to herself, and laughing at them, for she had a lively spirit and would not easily be put out of humor. She told the story among her friends, however, for she could not help speaking of something that had struck her so much, and from that moment, Mr. Darcy was looked upon with great dislike by almost everyone in the room. Mr. Bingley, by contrast, was universally loved. He had danced with Jane Bennet twice, more than with any other lady, and he had spoken to her with such warmth and admiration that Mrs. Bennet returned home in a state of great excitement. It was generally agreed that Mr. Bingley could not have shown greater preference to anyone. Jane herself was pleased, though she said very little. She was not one to speak too highly of anyone, or to imagine too much, but her heart told her that she had been noticed, and that Mr. Bingley had been very kind. Elizabeth, however, felt differently. She had seen enough to form her own opinion. She thought Mr. Bingley's manner was perfectly amiable, and that he was a man of great sweetness of temper, but his friend Mr. Darcy was arrogant, proud, and unfeeling. To speak of anyone as tolerable and not handsome enough was rude beyond measure, in her eyes. She resolved to dislike him thoroughly, and nothing she saw that evening inclined her to change her mind. And so the evening ended. The Bennets returned home, their minds full of what had passed. Mrs. Bennet spoke of nothing but Mr. Bingley and his fortune, and how certain she was that he would soon make Jane an offer. Jane listened with a smile, but said little. Elizabeth said even less, though her thoughts were busy indeed, turning over the words of the proud Mr. Darcy, and resolving that she would never like him, no matter how rich or handsome he might be. The days that followed were filled with talk of nothing else. At Longbourn, the name of Mr. Bingley was on every tongue, and even the servants had heard how rich he was, and how greatly he had admired Miss Jane. Elizabeth, sitting by the window one quiet morning, watched the sunlight fall across the fields and thought over all that had happened. She could still see Mr. Darcy standing there in the corner of the room, his face serious and reserved, his manner so distant that it seemed he thought himself above everyone present. She could hear his voice, quiet yet clear, saying those words about her, tolerable, but not handsome enough. It stung her, more than she cared to admit. Not that she valued his opinion, indeed, she told herself she despised it, but there was something so cold, so unkind, in the way he had spoken that it rankled in her mind. "He is certainly a very proud man," she said to Jane, as they sat together later that day. "And very disagreeable into the bargain. Handsome he may be, but I would not call him amiable, not in the least." Jane smiled gently. "Perhaps he is merely shy, Lizzie. Mr. Bingley is so open and lively that anyone might seem reserved beside him. I dare say he does not speak because he is not used to company, and knows not what to say. Or perhaps he thinks no one here is worth speaking to," replied Elizabeth, with a little lift of her chin. "That is more likely, is it not? He looked at us as though we were beneath his notice. I saw the way he looked at our dresses, our manners, as if he found something to object to in every one of us." "Nay, do not judge him too harshly," said Jane. "We know very little of him. He may have excellent qualities, for all that. His friend Mr. Bingley thinks very highly of him, you know, and Mr. Bingley is not mistaken in people, I am sure." Elizabeth shook her head. "I do not doubt that Mr. Bingley is kind. But even the best of men may be deceived in their friends. Mr. Darcy has the appearance of being a man of great consequence, I grant you, but his countenance does not please me. There is pride in every line of it. And pride, when it is not supported by humility, is always disagreeable." She turned her gaze back to the window, and let her thoughts wander. It was a soft, golden afternoon. The trees were heavy with summer leaves, and the air was warm and still. How strange, she thought, that one evening, one chance meeting, one careless remark, could color one's view of a person so completely. She told herself she did not care what Mr. Darcy thought of her. She was Elizabeth Bennet, and she had her own worth, her own spirit, her own mind, and none of it depended upon the good opinion of a proud gentleman from Derbyshire. Yet still, the words lingered. "Not handsome enough to tempt me." Well, she would endeavour never to be tempted, then. And she would take care that he never saw how much he had vexed her. Mrs. Bennet came bustling into the room, her face bright with news. "My dearest girls," she cried, "I have just heard from Mrs. Long. Mr. Bingley is to return the visit. He is coming here, to Longbourn, tomorrow. Only think of it! He is actually coming to our house." Elizabeth and Jane exchanged a look. Jane's cheeks coloured slightly, but she said nothing. "And his sisters?" asked Elizabeth. "Will they come too?" "That we do not know," said her mother. "But if they are wise, they will stay away, for Mr. Bingley sees enough of them, I dare say. It is he who matters, my dear, he and his regard for our Jane. Did you see how he looked at her? Twice he danced with her. Twice! And he spoke to her as though she were the only lady in the room. I am certain that he is already quite in love with her." Jane tried to calm her. "Pray do not be so sure, mamma. He was civil, certainly, and very pleasant. But that is all. We must not build hopes on so little." "Civil? Pleasant?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "My dear Jane, he looked at you as if he saw no one else in the room. And when a young man of such fortune behaves in that way, depend upon it, he means something more than mere civility." Elizabeth smiled to herself. Her mother's hopes were always high, and always running ahead of the facts. Yet she could not deny that Mr. Bingley had shown Jane particular attention. There had been kindness in his manner, and an eagerness to hear what she said, and a warmth that had been very pleasant to witness. If he were indeed coming to Longbourn tomorrow, then perhaps, just perhaps, there was something in what her mother said. That evening, as the sun set and the room grew dim, Elizabeth sat beside the open window, listening to the crickets begin their song in the long grass. She thought of Mr. Bingley, open, warm, generous, and then of Mr. Darcy, silent, proud, and cold. How strange it was that two men so different should be such close friends. She wondered what bound them together. Perhaps Mr. Bingley's sweetness softened Mr. Darcy's pride, or perhaps Mr. Darcy's strength gave weight to Mr. Bingley's gentleness. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth felt certain that she and Mr. Darcy would never be friends. She had formed her opinion, and she meant to keep it. "Let him be proud," she whispered to the quiet air. "I shall not care. I shall be just as happy, and just as content, without his good opinion." Yet as she spoke the words, a little voice deep inside her wondered, what if she were wrong? What if beneath that cold exterior, there was something more? Something that had not yet been seen? She shook the thought away. No. She had heard him speak. She had seen his face. She knew exactly what sort of man he was, and she wanted nothing to do with him. Tomorrow, Mr. Bingley would come. And perhaps his sisters, and perhaps even Mr. Darcy himself. If he should appear at Longbourn, Elizabeth resolved that she would be perfectly civil as he was rude, and that she would not, under any circumstances, show him how much his words had stung. She would be calm and composed, and she would laugh at his pride, quietly, within her own heart, and she would not give him the satisfaction of knowing that he had troubled her. With that resolution firmly in her mind, Elizabeth closed the window, and turned away from the twilight, ready to face whatever the morrow might bring. Chapter 2. The following morning brought bright sunshine and a light, pleasant breeze that stirred the curtains at Longbourn's windows. Breakfast had barely finished when word was brought that Mr. Bingley had arrived. Mrs. Bennet's face lit up at once. She fussed over her daughter's gowns, smoothed her own gown, and paced the room as she waited, her excitement barely contained. Mr. Bennet sat in his usual chair, half amused by his wife's agitation, though he too seemed curious to see the young man who had made such an impression on the whole neighbourhood. When Mr. Bingley entered the parlour, he was every bit as agreeable as report had described him. He carried himself with easy grace, his smile warm and sincere, and he greeted every member of the family with equal courtesy. He spoke to Mrs. Bennet with great respect, listened to Mr. Bennet with evident interest, and turned again and again to Jane, directing his conversation toward her as naturally as though drawn there by some gentle force. He spoke of Netherfield, of the countryside, of the walks and views to be found nearby, all in a tone so lively and so engaging that even Elizabeth, who was quick to observe and slow to be entirely charmed, found herself liking him very much. Yet he had come alone. Mrs. Bennet could not help asking after his companions. "Your sisters, sir? And that gentleman who was with you at the assembly, Mr. Darcy? I had hoped they might have come with you today." Mr. Bingley smiled. "My sisters remain at Netherfield, busy with household matters. As for Mr. Darcy, he is at home, and very much occupied. He is not fond of paying morning calls, I fear, and will always choose a quiet room and a book over company, when he has the choice." Elizabeth looked up quickly. "Does he read a great deal, then?" "Very great deal indeed," replied Mr. Bingley. "And few books please him as they ought. He has excellent taste and very high standards, both for books and for the world around him. But you must not judge him too harshly on that account, Miss Elizabeth. Where he respects, he admires deeply. It is only that he does not easily find things to admire." Elizabeth said no more, but she thought the answer told her a great deal. It confirmed her impression. Mr. Darcy saw himself as above most things and most people. High standards were all very well, she thought, but when they made one cold and unkind to those one scarcely knew, they were virtues turned to fault. Mr. Bingley stayed for nearly an hour. Before he left, he invited the entire Bennet family to a dinner at Netherfield Park later in the week. Mrs. Bennet accepted with delight, already counting the days until the visit. Jane said little, but her soft smile told Elizabeth that she was very much pleased. When the door had closed behind him and the sound of his carriage had faded away, Mrs. Bennet could contain herself no longer. "Did you see him, Jane? Did you see how he looked at you? He spoke to no one half so much." Depend upon it, he is already quite partial to you. And a dinner at Netherfield. Only think of it, we shall meet his sisters, and see the house, and be received as his friends." Jane begged her to be calm. "He was very civil, Mamma, but he was civil to everyone. Do not imagine more than is there." Elizabeth shook her head, though she smiled. Jane will not see what is plain to everyone else. She will not allow herself to hope, and perhaps that is wisest. But in truth, Elizabeth too had noticed. Mr. Bingley's preference for Jane had been open and sincere. He had sought her opinion, listened when she spoke, and seemed happier when she smiled. It was impossible not to be pleased at seeing her gentle sister so admired. Yet Elizabeth could not help wondering, if Mr. Darcy had come too, would he have looked on with approval? Or would he have found something to disapprove of in every word and gesture? Over the next few days, the talk of Netherfield never ceased. Mrs. Bennet planned what they should wear, wondered how the sisters would behave, and speculated endlessly on what sort of women they might be. Jane said very little, though she listened patiently to every word. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found her thoughts turning often to Mr. Darcy, not with admiration, certainly, but with a kind of determined curiosity. She pictured him in her mind, tall, reserved, his face serious and composed, saying little and expecting much. She told herself she disliked him entirely, and yet she found herself watching for his name, listening whenever he was mentioned, and forming fresh opinions on the smallest reported detail. The day of the Netherfield dinner arrived at last. The weather held fair, and the short journey passed pleasantly. Netherfield Park was a handsome, spacious house, set well back from the road among fine old trees, with gardens that stretched away toward the distant hills. Everything about it spoke of comfort and good taste, and of wealth, though displayed with restraint. Mr. Bingley received them at the door, and led them inside with great courtesy. His sisters were there, Caroline Bingley, elegant and sharp-eyed, and her sister Louisa Hurst, quieter and more composed. They greeted the Bennets politely enough, though Elizabeth observed at once a certain coolness in their manner, a faint air of condescension, as though they were doing their visitors a favour by receiving them at all. And there, standing near the fireplace, was Mr. Darcy. He was even more striking at home than he had been at the assembly. Dressed in fine dark clothing, he stood tall and still, his expression calm and unreadable. As they entered, his gaze swept over the group, and rested for a moment on Elizabeth. She met his look directly, her chin lifted just a little. He gave a slight, formal bow, and said nothing. Dinner was served soon afterward. Elizabeth found herself seated some distance from Mr. Darcy, but close enough to observe him. He spoke little, and then only to Mr. Bingley or to his own party. He listened politely, but rarely smiled, and seemed to weigh every word that was said before allowing it to pass. The Bingley sisters talked brightly of fashion, of acquaintances in London, of people and places the Bennets had never heard of, topics chosen, it seemed to Elizabeth, to mark the difference between their world and that of Longbourn. Jane, however, remained unshaken. She spoke gently and pleasantly, answering questions with grace, and winning even the Bingleys' attention by her sweetness and good sense. Mr. Bingley sat beside her, and it was plain to see that he was entirely captivated. He leaned toward her, spoke with animation, and laughed at whatever she said, so openly fond that Elizabeth began to think her mother's hopes might not be so foolish after all. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room after dinner, Caroline Bingley turned at once to Mr. Darcy, speaking in a voice meant to carry across the room. "Miss Jane Bennet is very pretty, I admit, but I confess I do not know how he can admire her so greatly. She has such a soft, yielding manner, and her family. Pray, did you see her mother? And those younger girls, chattering away as if they had never seen a fine house before. It is quite dreadful to think of Mr. Bingley connecting himself with such people." Elizabeth was standing near enough to hear every word. She did not turn around, but she felt a quiet anger rise within her, not for herself, but for her mother and sisters, and most of all for Jane, who sat calmly by, unaware of the criticism. Mr. Darcy's voice came, low and composed. "I have no doubt it is a great trial to him. But such is the charm of novelty, I suppose." Caroline Bingley smiled. "And Miss Elizabeth, she has a lively look about her, certainly. But she has none of the elegance one might wish. Her manners are quite, what shall I say? Quite lacking in refinement." "I have not found her so," replied Mr. Darcy. "I thought her very intelligent. But I confess I have not spoken with her enough to judge." Elizabeth turned away before he could say more. She had heard enough. They judged her family, they judged her, and they did so from a height of pride that she found deeply offensive. Mr. Darcy might think her tolerable, she thought, and her manners lacking, but at least she did not speak ill of people behind their backs. At least she was honest, and open, and warm. She would not trade her nature for all the elegance in Derbyshire. When the evening ended and the Bennets took their leave, Mr. Bingley walked with them to the door, speaking earnestly to Jane all the way. Mr. Darcy stood in the doorway, watching them go. His eyes met Elizabeth's once more, and again, he gave that slight, formal bow. She inclined her head in return, cool and composed, and stepped into the carriage without another glance. On the journey home, Mrs. Bennet talked of nothing but Mr. Bingley's kindness and the certainty of an engagement soon. Jane said little, but her happiness was clear. Elizabeth alone remained quiet. She thought of the evening, of the Bingley sisters' condescension, and of Mr. Darcy, polite, distant, and quietly critical. She had resolved to dislike him before, and now, after seeing him in his own home, seeing the company he kept and the opinions he allowed to pass unchallenged, she felt her dislike harden into certainty. He was proud. He was cold. And no matter how wealthy or handsome he might be, she would never respect him. The carriage rolled along the moonlit road, the wheels turning softly over the smooth ground. Inside, the mood was divided. Mrs. Bennet chattered on, her voice rising and falling with excitement, while Jane sat with her hands folded in her lap, gazing out at the passing shadows, her face glowing with quiet pleasure. Elizabeth sat opposite them, leaning back against the cushions, her eyes half closed, though in truth she was far from asleep. Her mind was busy, turning over every word, every glance, every gesture she had seen that evening. It was not that she wished to be offended, she told herself that firmly. She did not seek out slights, nor did she look for insults where none were intended. But what she had seen and heard at Netherfield had been too plain to be misunderstood. The Bingley sisters had treated them with the barest civility, as though politeness were a duty they grudgingly performed. They had spoken of London and fashion and grand acquaintances, all the while knowing that such things were scarcely known in the quiet village of Longbourn, and they had done it with a kind of smiling arrogance that made Elizabeth's blood run warm. And then there was Mr. Darcy. She kept seeing him in her mind, standing tall and silent by the fireplace, his face calm and impassive, listening while others spoke, rarely offering a word himself. He had not been rude, not openly. He had bowed, he had replied when spoken to, he had behaved as a gentleman ought. Yet there had been something in his manner, a quiet remoteness, a look that seemed to measure and judge, that told her exactly what he thought. He looked upon her family as beneath him. He looked upon her as beneath him. And though he had not said so aloud, his silence had spoken loudly enough. "He is the proudest man I have ever met," she murmured to herself, so quietly that no one heard. "And what is he to be so proud of? A large fortune, perhaps, and fine estates in Derbyshire. But are those things enough to make one superior to all the rest of the world? Can lands and gold bestow goodness, or kindness, or true worth? I think not." She thought of Mr. Bingley, by contrast, open, generous, warm-hearted, and entirely without conceit. He was rich as well, yet he carried his fortune lightly, and treated everyone with equal respect. How was it, she wondered, that two men so different could be such close friends. What bond could there be between a man who saw only the best in everyone, and a man who seemed to find fault with nearly everything? "Lizzie, you are very quiet," said Jane softly, turning from the window. "Are you quite well?" Elizabeth smiled, leaning forward to touch her sister's hand. "Perfectly well, Jane. Only thinking." "Thinking of what?" "Of Mr. Bingley." Jane's voice dropped lower so that their mother might not hear. "He was very kind to me this evening." "More than kind." "He was indeed," said Elizabeth warmly. "And it is easy to see why. No one could speak with you, Jane, and not be charmed. You are the best of us all, gentle, generous, and true. If he cannot see your worth, then he is blind indeed, and if his friends do not value you, then the fault is theirs, not yours." Jane looked down, her cheeks flushing in the dim light. "Do not speak so sharply of his friends, Lizzie. They are unused to our ways, perhaps, and their world is different from ours. It does not mean they are unkind at heart. And Mr. Darcy, I am sure he means no harm. He is merely quiet, and perhaps a little shy. One cannot judge a man entirely by his silence." Elizabeth shook her head, though she did not argue. She loved her sister's sweetness, loved it deeply, but she could not share it. Jane always saw the best in everyone, and would believe in goodness until it was plainly proven otherwise. Elizabeth saw more clearly, and trusted less easily, and in Mr. Darcy's case, she felt certain her mistrust was well placed. When they arrived back at Longbourn, the house was quiet, and the moon stood high in the sky. The girls separated to their rooms, but Elizabeth stayed awake long after she had blown out her candle, sitting beside the window where the moonlight fell across the floor. She thought about pride, what it was, and when it became a fault. There was a noble pride, she thought, a respect for oneself, a determination to act with honor and integrity. But there was also a foolish pride, a pride that looked down on others, that valued wealth and rank above character, that shut one's heart against the world. And that, she felt certain, was the pride Mr. Darcy carried. She resolved, then and there, not to let him trouble her. If he chose to think her beneath his notice, so be it. She would not alter her behavior to win his approval. She would be exactly what she was, lively, plain-spoken, true to herself, and if he found that lacking in refinement, then let him think so. She did not wish to be refined in his fashion. She would rather be herself, and be disliked, than be something she was not, and win his good opinion. In the days that followed, Netherfield seemed to draw closer, rather than farther away. Mr. Bingley called again, and often, always warmly received, always delighted to be at Longbourn. He came sometimes alone, sometimes with his sisters, but never, it seemed, with Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth found herself wondering why. Was he staying away on purpose? Or did he truly prefer the solitude of his own room to the company of those he thought unworthy? Whenever the name of Darcy was mentioned, Elizabeth would listen carefully, watching for any sign of his character. Once, Mr. Bingley spoke of him with great affection. "He is my oldest friend," he said. "And despite all his reserve, there is no better man alive. His heart is as good as his manners are cold, once you know him. I only wish he would allow himself to be known." Elizabeth had kept her counsel then, though she had thought to herself, a good heart does not show itself in contempt. A kind man does not speak of strangers as though they are beneath him. Yet she held her tongue, for she did not wish to contradict Mr. Bingley, nor to prejudice him against his friend. Privately, however, she remained firm. She had seen enough. She had heard enough. And until Mr. Darcy gave her clear proof to the contrary, she would continue to believe him proud, arrogant, and unworthy of further regard. So the weeks passed, summer ripening into golden autumn. Jane grew happier with every visit from Mr. Bingley, and Mrs. Bennet grew more certain of a wedding with every sunrise. Elizabeth watched over them all, glad for her sister, but still watchful, still ready to see fault where others saw only sunshine, and still holding fast to her opinion of the distant, silent gentleman at Netherfield. Chapter 3. A week had passed since the dinner at Netherfield, and the neighbourhood was once again gathering for an evening assembly at the town hall. The rooms were filled with familiar faces, the lights burned bright, and the music was already playing as the Bennets made their way inside. Mrs. Bennet hurried forward, eager to be seen. Jane walked gently beside her, her expression calm and sweet. Elizabeth followed, her eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity, half hoping, and half dreading, to see a certain tall, dark-haired gentleman standing among the guests. Mr. Bingley was there, as expected. He came forward at once to greet them, his manner warm and open. He spoke to Elizabeth, but his gaze turned constantly toward Jane, and it was plain to everyone that his attachment grew stronger with every meeting. Before long, he had asked Jane to dance, and as they took their places on the floor, Elizabeth watched them together, feeling a quiet joy rise in her heart. Her sister deserved all the happiness in the world, and it seemed as though she might at last be finding it. Then, Elizabeth caught sight of him. Mr. Darcy stood near the far wall, speaking with Caroline Bingley. He appeared even more composed than before, his posture straight and graceful, his face calm and unreadable. As Elizabeth looked across the room, his eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he gave a slight nod, and turned back to his conversation, as though her presence was of no greater consequence than a shadow passing across the floor. Elizabeth felt a flash of annoyance, quickly followed by resolve. Let him be distant, she thought. I shall not care. I shall go about my evening, and enjoy myself, and pay him no more attention than he pays me. Presently, however, Mr. Darcy walked across the room, and to her surprise, he stopped directly before her. Are you inclined to dance this evening, Miss Elizabeth? He asked. His voice was formal, his expression unchanged. Elizabeth looked up at him, her chin lifting just a little. I am not dancing at present, sir. I prefer to observe. Or perhaps you prefer not to dance with me, said Darcy. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet, direct curiosity. Elizabeth smiled, though her eyes were sharp. I had not thought about it, sir. But I believe we are both too proud to make good partners. You are accustomed to being admired, and I am not accustomed to being looked down upon. I doubt we should suit one another at all. Mr. Darcy stared at her, clearly taken aback. For a moment he said nothing, and then a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. You speak plainly, Miss Elizabeth. Most plainly of any lady I have ever met. Is that a fault? She asked. It is a quality, he replied. And one that few possess. I shall remember it. With that, he bowed and walked away, leaving Elizabeth standing there, wondering at his words, and feeling strangely unsettled. She had expected him to be offended, or to dismiss her with cold politeness. She had not expected him to listen, nor to speak of her words with such gravity. Later that evening, Elizabeth found herself in conversation with an old acquaintance, Mr. Wickham, a young and handsome lieutenant newly stationed in the town. He was charming, lively, and possessed a warmth of manner that made everyone like him instantly. He spoke to Elizabeth with such ease and kindness that she found herself forgetting everything else, and listening to him with great interest. Before long, the name of Mr. Darcy was mentioned. Wickham's expression changed, just for a moment, growing serious and troubled. You know Mr. Darcy, then? Asked Elizabeth. Indeed I do, replied Wickham, his voice quiet. I have known him since we were children. His father was the truest friend I ever had, and he left me in his son's care when he died. I had every reason to expect kindness and support. Instead, I was treated with neglect, and worse. Mr. Darcy has done me a great wrong, Miss Elizabeth, a wrong I shall never forget. He has all the pride and power, and I have nothing, and so the world takes his side, and believes whatever he says." Elizabeth listened, her heart filling with indignation. "That cannot be. He appears so honourable, so respectable." "Appearances are often deceptive," said Wickham, sadly. "He is proud, so very proud. And he would never suffer anyone to stand beside him as an equal. I was poor, and he made sure I remained so. He robbed me of my rightful inheritance, and then he spoke ill of me to anyone who would listen, so that no one would believe my side of the story." Elizabeth felt her dislike of Mr. Darcy harden into something far stronger. Everything made sense now, his coldness, his arrogance, his cruel words at the assembly. He was not merely proud, he was unjust, unkind, and unworthy of the respect he demanded. "I believe you entirely," she said warmly. "And I shall never think well of him again, no matter what he may say in his own defense." Wickham thanked her with a gentle smile. "Your good opinion means more than I can say, Miss Elizabeth. I only ask that you speak of this to no one, for I do not wish to cause trouble, nor to make enemies of those who are powerful. I have learned to bear my misfortunes in silence." Elizabeth promised to keep his secret, though she burned with anger, and longed to expose Mr. Darcy for the man he truly was. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth watched Darcy from across the room. He stood speaking to Mr. Bingley, calm and assured, as though he had never done anything wrong in his life. How dare he look so noble, she thought, when his heart was so black? How dare he carry himself with such dignity when he had treated an orphan boy with such cruelty? When it was time to leave, Darcy passed near her once more. He paused, as though about to speak, but Elizabeth turned away, her head held high, and walked out of the room without a single glance in his direction. She had made up her mind. She knew the truth now. Mr. Darcy was not merely disagreeable, he was wicked. And she would never, under any circumstances, give him the chance to deceive her again. On the carriage ride home, Elizabeth sat in thoughtful silence, her mind turning over every word that Wickham had spoken. She could scarcely believe it, and yet, the more she considered it, the more perfectly everything seemed to fit. Darcy's pride, his coldness, his reluctance to associate with anyone outside his own circle, all of it made sense now. A man who would treat a childhood friend so cruelly, who would rob him of his rightful place and then speak ill of him to hide his own injustice, such a man would naturally be distant, arrogant, and unkind. "Lizzie, you are unusually quiet tonight," said Jane gently, noticing her sister's troubled expression. "Is something amiss?" Elizabeth hesitated. She had promised Wickham to keep his secret, and yet it felt unjust to remain silent, when Jane might still be inclined to give Darcy the benefit of the doubt. At last, she leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "I have learned something this evening, Jane, something about Mr. Darcy. Something that changes everything." Jane looked concerned. "What do you mean? What has happened?" Elizabeth told her then, carefully, and without mentioning names, of Wickham's story, of the injustice he had suffered, and of the cruelty Darcy had shown him. She spoke with warmth, her indignation growing as she recounted every detail. When she finished, she looked at Jane, expecting her to agree, to share her anger, to see the truth as clearly as she did. But Jane frowned, her brow drawn into a gentle knot. "This is very serious, Lizzie. More serious than you perhaps realize. If it is true, if Mr. Darcy has indeed behaved so badly, then he is not the man we thought." "But are you certain? Did you hear this from Mr. Wickham alone?" "Who else should tell it?" said Elizabeth. "Darcy would never admit to such wrongdoing. And why should Wickham lie? He has nothing to gain by it, nothing at all. He spoke of it with sorrow, not with anger. He asked me to keep it secret, for goodness sake. Does that sound like a man inventing falsehoods? Jane shook her head slowly. I do not say he is lying, Lizzie. I only say, we have heard but one side. Mr. Darcy is proud, I grant you, and perhaps he has faults. But from what I have seen of him, from what Mr. Bingley tells me, I find it hard to believe he could be so very wicked. There may be circumstances we do not understand. There may be another side to the story. Elizabeth sighed, her frustration growing. You always see the best in everyone, Jane. Even when the truth is staring you in the face. You would find excuses for Mr. Darcy if he had stolen your very home. But I tell you, I believe Wickham. I saw his face. I heard his voice. A man cannot pretend such sorrow, such quiet dignity. And Darcy looked at me that evening, and spoke to me this very night, and all the while, he knew what he had done. He looked me in the eye and said nothing. That is not merely pride, that is deceit. Jane reached out and touched her sister's hand. Do not be so hasty to judge, I beg you. One evening, one story, it is not enough to condemn a man entirely. Let us wait. Let us observe. Perhaps in time, the truth will become clear, and until then, let us not speak ill of Mr. Darcy behind his back, any more than we should wish him to speak ill of us. Elizabeth fell silent. She loved Jane deeply, and respected her judgment, but on this occasion, she felt certain her sister was mistaken. She knew what she had heard. She knew what she had seen. And she knew her own heart, which told her, with absolute certainty, that Wickham had spoken the truth, and that Darcy was guilty of all that had been laid at his door. In the days that followed, Elizabeth found herself watching for every opportunity to confirm her opinion. Whenever Darcy was mentioned, she listened closely, and whenever she heard something that supported her view, she stored it away in her mind, as further proof of his character. When she heard that he had looked down upon some respectable family, or spoken sharply to a servant, or refused to acknowledge an acquaintance, she nodded to herself, and thought, yes. This is exactly what I expected. This is the man he truly is. And whenever she heard something in his favor, that he was generous to the poor on his estates, that he was a devoted brother, that he was steady and true in his friendships, she dismissed it. That is merely his reputation, she told herself. That is what the world believes, because it does not know the truth. One great act of injustice outweighs 100 small virtues. If he can treat Wickham so cruelly, then all his goodness is nothing but a pretense. She saw Wickham once again, shortly afterward. He spoke to her with the same gentle courtesy, the same quiet charm, and he made no further mention of Darcy, nor of his grievances. This only served to strengthen Elizabeth's opinion of him. He does not seek revenge, she thought. He does not seek to spread slander. He merely told me the truth, because he could not bear to be misunderstood any longer. Her feelings toward Darcy, meanwhile, hardened into something far stronger than dislike. It was no longer merely pride that she condemned, it was hypocrisy, injustice, and cruelty. Every time she thought of him, standing tall and respected in society, wearing his reputation like a fine coat while hiding such wickedness beneath it, she felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks. She resolved that she would never speak to him of the matter, never give him the satisfaction of knowing what she had heard, but she would watch him. She would observe him closely. And if he gave her the slightest opportunity, she would let him know, quietly, but clearly, that she saw through his disguise, and that she knew exactly what sort of man he was. One afternoon, as she walked through the village, she saw Darcy coming toward her on horseback. He reined in his horse when he saw her, and dismounted, standing before her on the path. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, bowing formally. "I trust you are well." Elizabeth did not curtsy. She stood straight and tall, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Perfectly well, sir. I have no complaints." Darcy looked at her, his expression searching. "You seem displeased. Have I said something to offend you?" "Nothing that you would admit to," replied Elizabeth, coolly. "Some wrongs are done in secret, sir. And some injustices are never spoken aloud, but that does not make them less real." Darcy stared at her, his face pale and serious. For a moment he seemed about to speak, then he checked himself, and bowed once more. "I see," he said quietly. "You have heard something. And you have believed it." "I have heard enough," said Elizabeth. "Time will show you the truth," said Darcy. There was a quiet gravity in his voice that Elizabeth could not help but notice, but she turned away, her heart hardened, and walked on without another word. As she went, she told herself she did not care what he said. She had chosen her side. She had made up her mind. And nothing that Mr. Darcy could ever say or do would ever change it. Chapter 4. Several weeks slipped gently by, bringing with them the soft gold of early autumn. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler, and the bond between Jane and Mr. Bingley deepened with every meeting. He called at Longbourn almost daily now, his visits looked forward to by all, by Mrs. Bennet with triumphant excitement, by Jane with quiet happiness, and by Elizabeth with warm approval, glad beyond measure that her dearest sister had found someone so kind, so generous, and so truly worthy of her. Yet alongside this growing joy ran another, darker current in Elizabeth's thoughts. She saw little of Mr. Darcy these days. He seemed to have withdrawn almost entirely from public view, but whenever his name was spoken, or his appearance noted riding across the countryside, her heart would harden within her. She thought constantly of Wickham, of his gentle manner, his handsome face, the quiet sorrow in his voice, and every time she recalled his story, her conviction strengthened. Darcy was a man of deep deceit, hiding cruelty beneath a noble bearing. Wickham himself remained a frequent and welcome presence in the neighbourhood. He joined every gathering, was universally liked, and seemed particularly pleased to speak with Elizabeth whenever they met. She felt flattered by his attention, and listened with eager sympathy whenever he spoke of his past, of his happy childhood beside the Darcy estates, of the kindness shown him by the elder Mr. Darcy, and of the bitter disappointment that had followed the old gentleman's death. He never spoke with rage, never with bitterness, always with a sad, resigned courtesy that only made Elizabeth admire him the more. One afternoon, Elizabeth and several of her acquaintances were walking together through the lanes near the village, when they encountered Mr. Darcy walking alone. He approached them with his usual formal grace, greeting the group, and then, to Elizabeth's surprise, paused directly before her. "I have been hoping to speak with you, Miss Elizabeth," he said quietly, his voice low so that the others might not overhear. "There is a matter." "I believe we have nothing left to say to one another, sir," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice clear and steady. "Not when one person knows the truth of the other's conduct." Darcy paused, his expression grave. "You speak as though you have made up your mind entirely. Before you turn me away, I ask only this: consider from whom you have heard these tales. There are two sides to every story. And the man who has spoken to you of me, he has his own reasons for painting me in the darkest colors." Elizabeth's eyes flashed. "Reasons indeed. Reasons that you yourself gave him. You robbed him of his inheritance, you blighted his prospects, and then you speak as though he is the one to be distrusted. I have heard enough, sir, more than enough. I know what you are capable of." Darcy stared at her, his face pale, his dark eyes searching hers. "You judge very readily, and very harshly. I did not imagine you so easily swayed by prejudice." "I judge by what I see," Elizabeth replied. "By your pride, your coldness, and by the suffering you have caused an innocent man who had done nothing to deserve your cruelty." For a moment it seemed as though Darcy would speak further, his lips parted, and there was something in his gaze, something almost like pain, but he checked himself. He gave a short, formal bow. "Then I must leave you to your opinion, Miss Elizabeth. Time alone will show which of us has judged rightly." With that, he turned and walked away, his stride steady, his bearing proud, yet Elizabeth thought she saw something defeated in the set of his shoulders as he went. She told herself it was merely guilt. Remorse, too late. She turned back to her companions, her heart beating fast, feeling righteous and strong, yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice whispered, "Was he truly guilty? Or did I speak too quickly?" She silenced it at once. She knew the truth. She had heard it from Wickham. And she would not doubt him. That very evening brought news of a different kind. A letter arrived at Longbourn from Netherfield, not for Elizabeth, but for Jane. Caroline Bingley had written, inviting Jane and her sister to spend a few days at Netherfield while the house was quiet. Mr. Bingley, it seemed, had been called away on business, and the ladies wished for company. Jane was delighted, and accepted at once. Elizabeth agreed to accompany her, curious to see how the Bingley sisters would behave without their brother there to soften their manners. The sisters arrived at Netherfield the following morning, and were received with great politeness, though Elizabeth soon observed that the warmth shown to Jane was largely for show. Caroline Bingley was particularly attentive to Darcy, who had reappeared at Netherfield that same day. She spoke constantly of him, praised his character, his family, his fine estate in Derbyshire, all the while casting sharp, sidelong glances at Elizabeth, as though daring her to disagree. When Darcy entered the room that afternoon, Elizabeth felt her temper rise at once. He greeted everyone politely enough, but when he came to her, he merely bowed, and said nothing. Caroline Bingley watched them closely, and soon began to speak, in a voice meant for Darcy's ears alone, of the arrival of Wickham in the neighbourhood, of his popularity, his charm, and the evident preference shown him by a certain young lady from Longbourn. Elizabeth felt the colour rise in her cheeks, but she kept her composure. She would not give Caroline the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Darcy, however, looked directly at Elizabeth, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze that was not pride, nor anger, but sorrow. "Mr. Wickham," said Darcy quietly, "is very fortunate in having so many kind friends to speak well of him." Then he turned and left the room, leaving Elizabeth to wonder, once again, at his words, his manner, and the strange, tangled web of truth and falsehood that seemed to surround him. The hours passed slowly after Darcy had left the room. Caroline Bingley laughed and chatted, her eye still darting toward the door, hoping he would return, but he did not come back. Jane sat quietly by the window, reading or speaking softly now and then with Mrs. Hurst, her manner gentle and unperturbed. Elizabeth, meanwhile, paced the room or sat pretending to read, her mind in a tumult of conflicting thoughts. Why had Darcy spoken so strangely? Why had he looked at her with such sadness? If he were truly guilty of all that Wickham had claimed, of greed, of cruelty, of robbing a helpless orphan, then surely he would have been angry, or defensive, or dismissive. He would have railed against Wickham, or denied everything, or treated her with contempt. Instead he had looked at her as though she had wounded him deeply, as though her good opinion mattered to him, and her loss of it was something he felt keenly. That is pride, she told herself firmly. That is merely the sting of being judged by someone he thought beneath his notice. He cannot bear that I, a country girl, should see through his fine reputation and know him for what he truly is. Yet the thought would not settle as easily as it once had. She recalled his words on the walk, "There are two sides to every story," and the quiet gravity with which he had spoken them. Could it be possible that Wickham had not told her everything? Could there be circumstances, facts, reasons, things she had never heard, never imagined, that would change the picture entirely? She shook her head. No. Why should Wickham lie? What could he possibly gain? He had spoken of it with reluctance, with sorrow, not with anger or a desire for revenge. He had asked her to keep it secret. If he were making it all up, would he not wish to spread the story far and wide? Would he not have told everyone in the neighborhood by now? That evening, as the three sisters sat together in the drawing-room after dinner, Caroline Bingley turned the conversation once more toward Mr. Darcy, his family, his importance, the great estate of Pemberley in Derbyshire that he would one day inherit. "It is a magnificent place," said Caroline, her voice soft with admiration. "Fine woods, great gardens, a river running through the valley, everything one could imagine. And the house itself, so noble, so stately. I have always said that no place in England can compare to Pemberley. And Mr. Darcy, he is the very model of a gentleman. Steady, honourable, highly principled, there is no man alive who can speak a word against him." Elizabeth looked up from her book. "Is there indeed no one?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. "I have heard otherwise. I have been told that he can be proud, harsh, and that he does not always treat those beneath him with the justice one might expect." Caroline laughed lightly. "Ah, you have been listening to idle gossip, no doubt. There are always those who will speak ill of anyone who stands high in the world. Mr. Darcy may be reserved, he may not wear his heart upon his sleeve, but he is incapable of doing anything mean or unjust. Anyone who says otherwise simply does not know him." Elizabeth said no more, but her heart burned within her. "You do not know him either," she thought. "Or perhaps you choose not to see his faults." She closed her book and walked to the window, looking out across the darkening parkland toward the distant trees. Somewhere in that great house, Darcy was sitting, perhaps reading, perhaps thinking, perhaps wondering what she truly believed of him. And she stood here, judging him, condemning him, on the word of one man alone. That night, as she lay awake in the quiet guest chamber, Elizabeth turned everything over in her mind. She thought of Wickham's charm, his easy grace, his warm smile, his way of making everyone feel special. She thought of Darcy's reserve, his silence, his dignity, his coldness to all but his closest friends. She knew which one she liked better. She knew which one felt more honest, more open, more true. But she also knew, deep down, that warmth and charm are not always proof of goodness, and that pride and silence are not always proof of wickedness. "I have been too quick," she admitted to herself at last. "I have listened to one story, and believed it entirely, and built my whole opinion upon it. I have let my dislike of his pride blind me to everything else. And I have judged him harshly, without ever giving him the chance to speak." But then Wickham's face rose before her, his gentle eyes, his quiet sorrow, and her resolve hardened again. No. He would not lie. He has no reason to. And Darcy has every reason to defend himself, yet he has barely spoken a word. If he is innocent, why does he not prove it? Why does he simply say there are two sides and walk away? There was no answer to be found in the quiet room, only questions that circled and turned, and would not rest. Elizabeth fell asleep at last, her mind still divided, her heart still pulled in two directions, toward the man who had charmed her with kindness, and the man who had been silenced by her prejudice, knowing that somehow, sooner or later, the truth must come out. And when it did, she knew, it would change everything. Chapter 5. The days at Netherfield passed in a curious kind of quiet. Mr. Bingley had not yet returned, and the house seemed to hold its breath without his warmth and cheerfulness to fill it. Jane remained gentle and uncomplaining, though Elizabeth could see the faint shadow of longing in her eyes whenever a carriage drove up the drive, only to pass by or bring some other visitor. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found herself watching Darcy more closely than ever, half hoping to catch him out in some fresh act of arrogance, half fearing that she might instead discover something that would soften her opinion and make her own prejudice the greater fault. One morning, Caroline Bingley came hurrying into the parlour, her face bright with news. "Letters have arrived. From Mr. Bingley. He writes that he has been called away to London, and may not return for some weeks, and he sends word that his sisters and the rest of us may follow him there, should we wish it. Jane turned pale and sat down slowly. She said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Elizabeth moved at once to her side, her heart aching for her sister. It was plain, painfully plain, that Bingley had left without seeing her, without a proper farewell, and now intended to remain far away. Worse still, Caroline's eyes were fixed on Jane with a look of quiet satisfaction, as though she had expected exactly this outcome. "Indeed," said Caroline, with a faint, knowing smile. "It is a great pity he could not stay. But business calls, you know, and once in London, he may be detained for months. He has so many engagements, so many friends and duties, one cannot expect him to remain in the country forever, merely for the sake of a passing fancy." Elizabeth's temper rose. She saw at once what was happening. Caroline and her sister were working together to separate Jane from Bingley, to keep them apart, and to persuade him that his attachment was nothing more than a fleeting amusement. They meant to keep him in London, among his own circle, and to make him forget her entirely. When Darcy entered the room a little later, Elizabeth looked at him directly. "Do you know why Mr. Bingley has been called away?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Is it truly business? Or has he been persuaded to leave by those who do not wish him well?" Darcy paused, taken aback by her directness. "I believe it is a matter of some importance," he replied carefully. "But I will not pretend his sisters are very glad he has gone. They have long wished for him to return to town. And they have spoken to him, I think, very plainly, regarding his choice of acquaintance." "And you," said Elizabeth. "Have you spoken too? Have you lent your voice to theirs? You have great influence over him, Mr. Darcy. If you have stood by and let them turn him away from Jane, then you are as guilty as they are." Darcy looked deeply troubled. "I have said nothing that was not true. I have advised him to be cautious, yes. But I have never told him whom to love. That is a thing no man can do for another. And I have certainly never wished him unhappiness, nor yours." "Cautious?" Elizabeth's voice trembled now. "Cautious of what? Of goodness? Of sweetness? Of a woman who would make him happier than any other alive? You speak of caution as though she were some danger. She is worth all of you put together, worth your pride, your fortune, your fine opinions, and you know it." With that, she turned and hurried from the room, leaving Darcy standing alone in the parlour, staring after her with an expression she had never seen before, a look of deep conflict, of something almost like regret, and of a feeling he seemed unable to name or master. That evening, Jane received a second letter, this one from Caroline herself, written from London. It spoke of Bingley's being deeply engaged there, of his enjoying himself greatly, and of his having every intention of remaining through the winter. Worse still, it spoke of his growing attachment to Darcy's sister, the lovely and accomplished Georgiana Darcy, as a match that everyone expected and approved. Jane read the letter in silence, her face pale, and then handed it to Elizabeth without a word. When Elizabeth had finished reading, her anger knew no bounds. It was all perfectly clear now. Caroline had lured him away, kept him there, and was deliberately trying to turn his heart toward another, all while Jane waited patiently in the country, believing him true. "They dare not let him see you," Elizabeth said fiercely. "They know he loves you. They know that if he were here, he would be at your side in an instant. So they keep him far away, and fill his ears with lies, and Darcy helps them. He stands by and lets it happen." Jane wept quietly. "Do not be so hard upon him, Lizzie. Perhaps he truly believes it is for the best. Perhaps he does not know how deeply Bingley cares. And if Mr. Bingley can be so easily persuaded to forget me, then perhaps he never loved me at all." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around her sister. "He does love you. I know he does. But he is gentle and trusting, and those around him are determined to keep you apart. And at the center of it all, standing silent and proud, and allowing it all to happen, is Mr. Darcy. From that moment, Elizabeth's dislike turned into something far sharper. She blamed him for everything, for Bingley's departure, for Jane's heartache, for the cruelty of the Bingley sisters, and for every tear that fell from her sister's eyes. He had the power to stop it, and he had chosen not to. He had chosen caution over kindness, and his own opinion over true love. And she would never, never forgive him for it. The following morning, the sisters prepared to leave Netherfield. There was no reason to stay. Bingley was gone, the house was being readied for the journey to London, and the atmosphere had grown so cold and strained that even Jane agreed it was time to return to Longbourn. As they walked out to the carriage, Elizabeth glanced back one last time, and saw Darcy standing in the doorway, watching them go. He made no move to follow, said no word of farewell, but stood tall and still, his face grave and his eyes fixed upon her. She turned away at once, her chin lifted, and stepped into the carriage without a single glance in his direction. The journey home was quiet. Jane sat gazing out the window, saying very little, her hands folded patiently in her lap. Elizabeth watched her sister's pale face, and her heart burned with a quiet, steady anger. She thought of Caroline Bingley's letter, its smooth, deceitful words, its deliberate cruelty, and of Darcy standing by and permitting it all to happen. He had admitted as much himself. He had advised caution. He had lent his great weight and influence to their side. And he had done it all while knowing, or at least suspecting, that Jane loved Bingley truly, and that Bingley loved her in return. "He thinks us beneath him," Elizabeth whispered to herself, so softly that Jane did not hear. "He thinks our family is not good enough for his friend. He thinks himself so high above us that he may dispose of our happiness as he pleases. Pride, that is all it is. Cold, arrogant, selfish pride. And he calls it honor." When they arrived back at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet was at once full of questions. Where was Mr. Bingley? Why had he not returned? When might they expect him? Elizabeth was forced to tell her that he had been called away to London, and might remain there for months. At this news, Mrs. Bennet fell into a state of great distress and complaint, lamenting that such a promising match should be so suddenly broken off, and declaring that it was all very hard and very unfair. Elizabeth did her best to soothe her, while Jane sat quietly in the corner, accepting her mother's lamentations with gentle patience, as though she had already resigned herself to disappointment. In the days that followed, Elizabeth watched over her sister with tender care. Jane tried to keep herself occupied, reading, walking, attending to household duties, but her smile had grown fainter, and her eyes often held a distant, sorrowful look, as though they were fixed upon some faraway place. Elizabeth admired her fortitude, and loved her all the more for her sweetness, yet she burned with indignation on her behalf. If Darcy and the Bingley sisters imagined that they could simply sweep into Jane's life, win her heart, and then cast her aside when it suited their convenience, they were very much mistaken. She thought often of the conversation she had shared with Darcy in the parlour at Netherfield. She recalled his words, "I have never told him whom to love," and the troubled look in his eyes as she had stormed away. Could it be true? Had he truly not interfered beyond offering advice? Or had he deliberately kept silent, knowing that his silence would carry more weight than any spoken word? She wanted to believe the worst of him. It was easier, simpler, safer, yet somewhere in her heart, a small, stubborn doubt remained. One afternoon, as she walked alone through the meadows near Longbourn, Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine a different version of events. What if Darcy had seen something she had not? What if he truly believed, however mistakenly, that Bingley was not fully in earnest? What if he thought he was protecting his friend from some harm or disadvantage that she, in her affection for Jane, had failed to see? She shook the thought away almost at once. No, she told herself. There is no harm in Jane. There is no disadvantage. She is goodness itself. And if he cannot see that, then he is blind, or proud, or both. Yet the doubt lingered, stubborn and persistent. She remembered how he had looked at her, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something that might almost have been pain. She remembered his quiet, steady voice when he had said, "Time will show you the truth." And she remembered, too, Wickham's warning, that Darcy was skilled at hiding his true nature, and that the world would always believe him before they believed anyone else. That was it, she told herself firmly. He was a master at appearing honorable. He had the manners, the reputation, the fortune, and the status to make everyone believe whatever he wished them to believe. Even she, sharp, observant, distrustful as she prided herself on being, had found herself wavering, wondering, questioning. That was exactly what he wanted. That was how he worked, silently, subtly, making others doubt their own eyes and ears, while he stood apart, appearing noble and wronged. From that day forward, Elizabeth resolved to steel her heart against him. She would not be charmed. She would not be softened. She would not listen to his smooth words or be moved by his grave looks. She knew the truth, or at least, she believed she did. He had wronged Wickham. He had helped to separate Jane and Bingley. And he was proud, deceitful, and unworthy of respect. Whatever doubts had briefly stirred within her were put firmly aside. She would hold fast to what she had heard, and what she had seen, and she would wait. Sooner or later, the truth must come out. And when it did, she would be ready. Chapter 6. The autumn settled deep and golden over the countryside, bringing crisp air and clear blue skies, yet little cheer to Longbourn. Jane bore her disappointment with admirable patience. She rose each morning, attended to her duties, spoke gently to all around her, and never uttered a bitter word against those who had treated her so unkindly. But Elizabeth saw the quiet sadness beneath her sister's composure. She watched the way Jane's smile faded when letters arrived from London, the way her gaze lingered on the road to Netherfield, the quiet sigh that escaped her whenever Mr. Bingley's name was mentioned. Elizabeth's heart ached for her, and every day, her resentment toward the authors of this unhappiness grew deeper and sharper. News travelled slowly from London, but what little came served only to confirm Elizabeth's worst fears. It was reported that Bingley remained entirely in the company of his sisters and Mr. Darcy, that he was seen everywhere with them, that he seemed devoted to the society of town, and that his attachment to Jane appeared to have been completely forgotten. Worse still, whispers began to circulate of a growing regard between him and Darcy's younger sister, the wealthy and accomplished Georgiana. To Elizabeth's mind, this was proof enough. They had maneuvered him, influenced him, and persuaded him to trade true affection for a grander, more advantageous match, and Darcy, she had no doubt, was the chief architect of it all. Meanwhile, Wickham remained a constant and welcome presence in the neighbourhood. He continued to be universally admired, handsome, courteous, and charming to all. Whenever they met, he spoke to Elizabeth with particular warmth and confidence, treating her as one of the few people in whom he could place his trust. He never pressed the subject of Darcy upon her, but he would occasionally let fall a quiet word or a sorrowful glance that reminded her of all he had suffered, and every such reminder strengthened Elizabeth's conviction that she had judged Darcy correctly from the very beginning. One afternoon, Elizabeth found herself walking with Wickham along the lane that led past the edge of the Netherfield estate. They spoke of many things, of his life before joining the militia, of his hopes for the future, of the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy. At length, Wickham paused, and looked toward the distant house with a melancholy expression. "I have avoided this road of late," he said quietly. "It brings back too many memories. I was raised to believe that this place would be my second home, that I should always be welcome beneath its roof. But the son of my father's friend has seen fit to cast me out, and to speak of me as though I were unworthy to walk upon his lands." Elizabeth's heart swelled with indignation. "It is shameful, unjust, and I am convinced that one day the whole truth shall be known. He cannot hide his true character forever. Wickham looked at her earnestly. "Your good opinion is a comfort to me, Miss Elizabeth, more than I can say. But I ask you again, do not speak of this to others. Let him keep his reputation. I would not drag his name through the mud, even though he has ruined my prospects. I only ask that you remember, when you see him at the height of his fortune and his pride, that he has acted basely toward one who loved him like a brother." "I shall remember it always," Elizabeth promised. "And nothing he can ever say or do will persuade me otherwise." It was not long after this conversation that the neighborhood received news of a different kind. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt, and one of the most powerful and formidable women in the country, was expected to visit her nephew at Rosings Park, her estate in Kent. And it was further reported that Darcy himself would be travelling there shortly, before returning to London. Elizabeth heard the news with indifference. Let him go, she thought. Let him carry his pride and his influence elsewhere. So long as he remained far away from Jane, and far away from those he could harm, she cared not where he went. Yet when she learned that her cousin, Mr. Collins, a man who had long been expected to inherit the Longbourn estate upon Mr. Bennet's death, was to pay a visit to her family, she found herself thinking of Rosings, and of Lady Catherine, and wondering whether the aunt shared the nephew's arrogance and coldness. Mr. Collins arrived at Longbourn one rainy evening, his carriage splashing through the mud, his manner a curious mixture of obsequious deference and self-importance. He was a clergyman, well-meaning but absurdly pompous, endlessly repeating phrases of admiration for his noble patroness Lady Catherine, and forever bowing and scraping to everyone he met. He spoke at great length of Rosings Park, of its grandeur, its gardens, its magnificent rooms, and of Lady Catherine's condescension, her wisdom, and her determination to see her nephew married suitably to her own daughter. Elizabeth listened with growing amusement, and then, with sudden interest. Married to her own daughter, she asked. Mr. Darcy is to marry his cousin. So it is universally understood, replied Mr. Collins, nodding solemnly. Lady Catherine intends it, and the young lady is a beauty, and with such fortune and such connections, it would be the most advantageous match imaginable. Mr. Darcy would scarcely dare oppose his aunt's wishes, even if he were inclined to do so. Elizabeth's mind raced. This explained so much. Darcy had no intention of marrying for love. He was destined for a union of rank and fortune, and that was exactly why he had worked so hard to separate Bingley from Jane. He had seen no advantage in the match, and had feared that Bingley's affection might lead him to marry beneath him. It was all pride, all calculation, all cold ambition, and she had been right to condemn him from the very start. As the evening wore on, Mr. Collins continued to talk of his patroness, of his duties, of his humble hopes to make a suitable marriage himself. Elizabeth listened politely, but her thoughts were far away, in London, in Derbyshire, and wherever Mr. Darcy might be, thinking with renewed certainty that he was exactly what she had always believed him to be, proud, ambitious, entirely without heart, and utterly unworthy of the good opinion of anyone who truly knew him. The days passed quickly under Mr. Collins's roof, bringing a curious mixture of amusement and exasperation to the Bennet family. He was unfailingly polite, endlessly grateful for their hospitality, and yet so excessively formal, so eager to praise his great patroness Lady Catherine, and so determined to speak at length upon every subject, that it required all of Elizabeth's good humour to endure him with patience. Mr. Bennet alone seemed able to enjoy his company, sitting quietly in his chair, listening to the pompous speeches with a twinkle in his eye, and asking questions that would send Mr. Collins into long, elaborate discourses which he would then leave unanswered, to the great confusion of his cousin. Mrs. Bennet, meanwhile, was divided between pleasure at receiving such a respectable relation and irritation at his constant praise of Lady Catherine and Rosings, which she felt was intended to make Longbourn appear small and insignificant by comparison. But when Mr. Collins began to speak of his earnest wish to marry, and of his desire to choose a wife from among the Bennet daughters, as a way of making some amends for the fact that he would one day inherit their home, Mrs. Bennet's temper improved at once. She began to hint broadly at the suitability of such a match, looking significantly toward Elizabeth as she spoke, and smiling with great satisfaction. Elizabeth, however, found the idea both absurd and unwelcome. She liked Mr. Collins well enough as a cousin and an acquaintance, but as a husband? He was ridiculous. She could not imagine a life spent listening to his speeches, enduring his deference to rank, and submitting to his narrow, ungenerous view of the world. She resolved firmly that come what may, she would never accept him. Yet it was his constant talk of Rosings and the de Bourgh family that most occupied Elizabeth's thoughts. Hour after hour, she heard of Lady Catherine's power, her imperious manner, her determination to arrange her nephew's future exactly as she saw fit. And every time the name of Darcy was mentioned, as it frequently was, her mind would turn over what she had learned. If he was indeed bound to marry his cousin, Miss de Bourgh, then his opposition to Jane and Bingley became even more understandable, in his own wretched, arrogant way. He valued rank and fortune above all things. He would not suffer his friend to marry a woman whose family lacked consequence, just as he himself would submit to a loveless marriage for the sake of status and connection. He is a man who has never known the value of anything that cannot be weighed or counted, Elizabeth said to herself one evening, walking alone in the garden after dinner. He knows the price of land, the worth of a fortune, the importance of a noble name, but he knows nothing of goodness, or gentleness, or true affection. He would sacrifice his own heart, and his friend's happiness, and the peace of anyone who stands in his way, all for the sake of a grand alliance and a lady's approval. She thought of Jane, quiet, patient, still hoping against hope for a word from Bingley, and her anger flamed up once more. Darcy had done this. He had taken Jane's happiness in his hands and cast it aside, simply because he deemed her unworthy of his friend. And he had done it all while wearing the face of honor and principle. As the weeks went by, Mr. Collins made his intentions plain. He directed his attentions firmly toward Elizabeth, and one morning, with great solemnity and formality, he asked her to marry him. She refused him plainly, firmly, and without hesitation, to his utter astonishment, and to his great distress. He could scarcely believe it. He assured her that she was the first woman he had ever addressed, that he had every expectation of being accepted, and that Lady Catherine herself would be highly pleased with his choice. But Elizabeth remained unmoved. She would not be persuaded, nor flattered, nor frightened into changing her mind, and at last, bewildered and deeply hurt, Mr. Collins withdrew his proposal. Mrs. Bennet, upon hearing the news, fell into a state of great alarm and displeasure. She spoke of Elizabeth's stubbornness, of the danger of remaining unmarried, and of the hardship that would befall them all when the estate passed into Mr. Collins's hands. But Elizabeth stood her ground. She would not marry where she could not respect, nor where she could not love, and least of all a man who looked upon marriage as nothing more than a convenient arrangement, approved by a great lady. In the midst of all this commotion, Elizabeth received a letter from her dear friend Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte wrote that she had accepted a proposal of marriage from Mr. Collins, that she did not love him, it was true, but that she valued security and respectability above romantic hopes, and that she believed she could be happy with him. Elizabeth read the letter with a heavy heart. She loved Charlotte, and wished her well, but it grieved her deeply to see her friend settle for so little, merely for the sake of an establishment. And as she laid the letter aside, she could not help thinking, is this what becomes of women who are not wealthy or highly connected? To marry without affection, or to remain unmarried and dependent. And all because men like Darcy decide who is worthy of happiness, and who is not. Her thoughts returned again and again to him, distant, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the lives he affected. He sat in his fine houses, among his equals, secure in his fortune and his pride, while here in the country, hearts were broken, lives were shaped and limited, and happiness was treated as something trivial and unimportant. I will not think of him, she told herself, though she knew it was a lie. He was always there, in her thoughts, in her judgments, in every observation she made of the world around her. She had built her opinion of him solidly, brick by brick, Wickham's story, Jane's suffering, his own cold words and haughty looks, and nothing, it seemed, would ever be able to shake it. Yet somewhere deep in her mind, faint and unacknowledged, a question lingered, unspoken and unwelcome. What if I am wrong? What if I have judged too quickly, listened too readily, and built my certainty upon sand? She pushed the thought away, as she always did. She had seen enough. She knew enough. And she would not doubt herself now, not for him. Chapter 7. The winter months rolled slowly across the countryside, bringing cold winds and grey skies, and with them, a quiet stillness settled over Longbourn. Jane continued to bear her disappointment with gentle courage. She wrote occasionally to her acquaintances in London, hoping for news of Mr. Bingley, yet the letters that came back spoke only of his constant engagement in town, his pleasure in the society of his sisters and Mr. Darcy, and his apparent contentment far away from Hertfordshire. No word came from him directly. No explanation, no farewell, no single line to soften the blow. Slowly, painfully, Jane began to accept that he was not coming back, that whatever regard he had once felt for her had been swept away by distance, persuasion, and the influence of those around him. Elizabeth watched her sister's quiet grief with a heart full of sympathy and burning indignation toward the man she held chiefly responsible. Every silence from London, every fresh report of Darcy's continued companionship with Bingley, every mention of his guiding hand upon his friend's affairs, all served to confirm her conviction. He had done this. He had deliberately separated two people who loved one another, and he had done it simply because he deemed Jane's family unworthy of his friend. He had sacrificed their happiness to his cold, arrogant view of the world, and he had done so without remorse, without hesitation, and without a single thought for the pain he was causing. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's friend Charlotte had married Mr. Collins and departed for his parsonage in Kent, close beside Rosings Park, the grand estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In due course, Charlotte wrote warmly, inviting Elizabeth to come and visit her in the spring. Elizabeth accepted gladly. She loved Charlotte, and wished to see her settled, yet she could not help feeling a quiet curiosity, too. To visit Rosings, to see the place where Darcy had been raised, to observe the household and the influence of his formidable aunt, it would, she thought, give her further insight into his character. If he was proud now, she imagined what he must be in the very home of his powerful relatives. As winter turned gently toward spring, Elizabeth received another invitation, this time to travel with her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners, on a journey through the northern counties of England. They spoke of beautiful scenery, of historic towns, and of the lakes and mountains far to the north. Elizabeth was delighted. The prospect of travel, of fresh air and new sights, was exactly what she needed to lift her spirits. Yet as she listened to their plans, she heard them mention that their journey would take them through Derbyshire, the very county where Mr. Darcy's great estate of Pemberley stood. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated. Should she go? Might she encounter him there in his own home? The thought filled her with conflicting feelings, a certain reluctance, a quiet defiance, and a strange, unnameable curiosity. She told herself firmly that she had nothing to fear. She knew his character now. She had seen his true nature. If they should meet, she would meet him with composure, and she would not, under any circumstances, allow him to see how deeply he had wounded her family. And so, putting aside her hesitation, she agreed to the journey. The weeks passed quickly in preparation. Elizabeth spent her remaining days at Longbourn walking with Jane, comforting her, and listening to her quiet resolve to put the past behind her. She saw Wickham from time to time, and he continued to be all that was amiable and kind, confirming every opinion she had ever held of him, and every judgment she had ever formed against Darcy. He spoke of Derbyshire with quiet feeling, recalling his childhood there, and Elizabeth listened with her heart swelling on his behalf. Yes, she thought. I shall see that place. I shall walk upon those lands. And I shall remember, wherever I go, that the master of Pemberley may own the house and the fields, but he does not own goodness, nor honor, nor true worth. At last, the day of departure arrived. Elizabeth bade farewell to her father, who gave her a twinkling smile and a playful warning not to fall in love with any gentleman on the journey. She embraced Jane, who stood bravely at the door, her face calm but her eyes wet. Then she climbed into the carriage beside her aunt and uncle, and the horses set off, carrying her away from Longbourn, away from all she knew, and toward the distant hills of Derbyshire, and the home of the man she had vowed to dislike forever. The journey was long, yet every mile brought fresh beauty to delight the eye. As they travelled northward, the flat fields of Hertfordshire gave way to rolling hills, green valleys, and clear streams that sparkled beneath the spring sunshine. Elizabeth sat beside the window, watching the landscape unfold, woods thick with new leaves, villages clustered around ancient churches, and distant mountains rising blue and hazy against the sky. Her spirits lifted with every mile. The air grew sweeter, the sky seemed wider, and for the first time in many months, Elizabeth found herself laughing freely and forgetting her cares beneath the grandeur of the world around her. Her aunt and uncle were delightful companions, intelligent, warm-hearted, and full of conversation. They spoke of many things, of history, of art, of the people they met, and Elizabeth enjoyed their company immensely. As they drew nearer to Derbyshire, however, she found her thoughts turning more and more often toward Pemberley. She had heard it described 100 times, by Mr. Collins, by Wickham, by others who had seen it, and she pictured it in her mind, grand, imposing, cold, a house built for pride rather than comfort, reflecting the character of its master in every stone. One evening, as they sat together at an inn near the borders of Derbyshire, Mrs. Gardiner turned to her with a smile. "My dear, we shall be within a few miles of Pemberley tomorrow. Would you care to see it? I have heard it spoken of as the finest estate in the whole county. The grounds are open to respectable visitors, and the house is shown when the family is away." Elizabeth's heart gave a sudden, unsteady beat. "And is Mr. Darcy not there?" she asked, as casually as she could. "He is in London, I understand," replied her uncle. "He departed some weeks ago, and is not expected back for some time. His housekeeper remains a most respectable woman, I am told, and she shows the place to visitors. We need not fear encountering him, if that is what troubles you." Elizabeth hesitated. She told herself she ought to decline. She ought to turn away, and never set foot upon his lands. Yet curiosity, that stubborn, persistent curiosity, was stronger than her resolve. She wanted to see the place where he had been raised. She wanted to walk through the rooms he inhabited, to look upon the pictures of his family, to see the home that had shaped him. Perhaps, she thought, if she saw it all, the grandeur, the wealth, the history, she would understand him better. Perhaps she would see exactly where his pride had been born, and why it had grown so great. And so, against her better judgment, she agreed. "Very well," she said quietly. "I should like to see it." That night, Elizabeth lay awake long after her aunt and uncle had fallen asleep. She thought of the morrow, of Pemberley, of its master, of the fact that she would walk through his home while he was far away. She told herself she did not care. She told herself it was merely a house, stones and wooden gardens, and that no building, however grand, could make its master worthy of respect. Yet beneath her defiance lay a strange, fluttering unease. What if she found something there that contradicted all she believed? What if she saw something that made her doubt her own judgment? She shook the thought away. Impossible, she told herself firmly. I know what he is. I have heard his words. I have seen his actions. A fine house cannot change the truth. When morning came, they set out early. The road wound upward through wooded slopes, until at last they came to a high point, and the valley of Pemberley lay spread out before them. Elizabeth leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. It was nothing like she had imagined. There was no cold, imposing fortress standing apart and proud. Instead, the house stood nestled among trees, built of fine grey stone that glowed softly in the morning light. It was noble and handsome, certainly, but it was also peaceful. It seemed to belong to the land around it, rather than standing above it. Below the house, a river wound through the valley, clear, bright, and unforced, flowing naturally, as though it had chosen its own course. Elizabeth gazed down upon the scene, and felt her heart stir with something she had not expected, admiration. It was beautiful. More beautiful than she had ever pictured. And as she looked upon the house and valley, she found herself thinking, almost against her will, I could have been mistress of this place. I might have walked here every day. Instead of looking upon it as a stranger, I might have called it my own. The thought came and went in an instant, leaving her cheeks burning. No, she told herself. Never. Not at any price. Not with him. Yet as the carriage rolled down the slope toward the house, she could not deny the quiet truth. Pemberley was a place to be loved, not feared. And if the place reflected the man, as people said it did, then perhaps there was more to Mr. Darcy than she had ever seen. Chapter 8. The carriage rolled smoothly down the winding drive, bringing them nearer to Pemberley with every turn. As they drew closer, Elizabeth observed the house more clearly, its fine proportions, the warm grey stone, the way it stood surrounded by ancient trees and sweeping lawns, appearing both grand and welcoming. There was no harshness here, no cold display of wealth, only a quiet dignity that seemed to flow from the building itself, as though it had grown naturally from the land rather than being imposed upon it. They were received by Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, a pleasant, sensible woman, neatly dressed, who greeted them with great civility and led them through the rooms. Everything was elegant, spacious, and beautifully proportioned, fine furniture, rich tapestries, portraits lining the walls, yet nowhere was there any excessive or ostentatious display. Elizabeth looked about her with growing admiration, and as they walked, Mrs. Reynolds began to speak of her master. "Mr. Darcy has been here since he was a small boy, you know," she said warmly. "I have cared for him since he was 5 years old. And a sweeter-tempered, more generous young man never lived." Elizabeth started. She had expected to hear of his pride, his reserve, his high standards, not this. "Is he then so very agreeable?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Indeed he is," replied Mrs. Reynolds. "He is the best master that ever lived. He is kind to everyone, to the poor, to his tenants, to his servants. He is steady, honorable, and true. Some call him proud, I know, but I have never seen anything of it. I believe it is merely that he does not chatter like other young men. He thinks deeply, and speaks only when he has something to say, and the world mistakes silence for arrogance." Elizabeth stood still, her mind reeling. This was not the Darcy she knew, the cruel, unjust man described by Wickham. "I have heard it said," she ventured cautiously, "that he is difficult to please, that he sets great store by rank and fortune, and looks down upon those who have less." Mrs. Reynolds shook her head firmly. "That is a mistake, miss. A great mistake. He may be quiet among strangers, but he does not value people for their birth or their gold. He values them for their worth. And he is generous, so generous. No one knows the half of what he does. He gives freely to those in need, and he does it quietly, so that no praise may come of it. As for his sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy, he is the most devoted brother that ever lived. He watches over her, guides her, and loves her with all his heart." Elizabeth listened, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She walked from room to room, looking at the portraits upon the walls, paintings of the Darcy family through the centuries, until at last she came to one of Mr. Darcy himself, painted in his youth. She stood before it, gazing up into his face. There was pride in the countenance, certainly, but there was also intelligence, gravity, and a deep, earnest goodness. She looked long and hard, searching for the cruelty Wickham had spoken of, yet she found none. "He bears a strong resemblance to his father," said Mrs. Reynolds softly, coming to stand beside her. "The old Mr. Darcy was the finest man I ever knew. And his son, he is just like him. Just as kind, just as honorable, just as true. There are those who would speak ill of him, I know, but do not believe it, miss. Those who know him best love him most." Elizabeth walked away slowly, her thoughts in complete turmoil. Could it be possible? Could she have been entirely mistaken? Had she judged him upon one man's story, a story that now began to ring hollow, while those who knew him best spoke nothing but good of him? She thought of Wickham, his charm, his warmth, his easy manner, and then of Darcy, silent, reserved, and universally loved by those who had known him longest. Which one was she to believe? As they stepped out into the garden, still turning these questions over in her mind, Elizabeth caught sight of a figure walking toward them along the woodland path. Tall, dark, and unmistakable, it was Mr. Darcy himself. Her breath caught in her throat. He was not supposed to be here. He was meant to be in London. He drew nearer, and to her utter astonishment, he paused before her, and instead of turning away with cold formality, he stopped, bowed, and spoke, his voice showing equal surprise, yet softened by something she had never heard there before. "Miss Elizabeth, I had no idea you were traveling this way. You must forgive me, I was not expecting to meet anyone I know." Elizabeth could scarcely speak. She stammered out a reply, confused, flustered, and entirely unprepared, and all the while, she watched him, wondering at the change in him. He was still grave, certainly, but he was not cold. He spoke politely to her aunt and uncle, offering them every attention, inviting them to walk wherever they pleased, apologizing that he had been unable to receive them properly. He was courteous, respectful, and remarkably unlike the proud, distant man she had known in Hertfordshire. When at last he took his leave, promising to return shortly and pay his respects to her relatives, Elizabeth stood rooted to the spot, watching him walk away. She had come to Pemberley expecting confirmation of everything she believed, and instead, she had found herself questioning every opinion she had ever held. The housekeeper's words, the portrait, and now this, his manner, his kindness, his humility, all of it told the same story. And as she stood there beneath the trees, she began to realize with a sinking heart, she might have been wrong. Terribly, shamefully wrong. For a long moment after he had departed, Elizabeth remained standing where he had left her, scarcely able to breathe. Her mind was in such a state of confusion, doubt, and bewilderment that she could scarcely think clearly. She had come to Derbyshire fully prepared to dislike him, to see only pride, coldness, and arrogance in everything connected with him. Instead, she had found warmth, generosity, and goodness, spoken of by those who knew him best, and shown to her plainly in his own behavior. Her aunt and uncle drew near, full of wonder. "He is vastly more handsome than I had been told," said Mrs. Gardiner. "And how very polite he was. Most agreeable. I had expected to find him proud and distant, yet he treated us with the utmost civility, as though we were equals. He bowed, he conversed, he offered every attention. Truly, I have seen gentlemen of far greater reputation who behaved with far less grace." Elizabeth murmured something in agreement, but her heart was heavy. If only they knew! If only they knew all that she had heard, all that she had believed. She had told them nothing of Wickham, nothing of the injustice, nothing of the wrongs she had laid at Darcy's door, and now, seeing him thus, she felt a deep sense of shame rising within her. Had she been foolish? Hasty? Prejudiced beyond all reason? She thought again of Mrs. Reynolds's words, "Those who know him best love him most." That was the truth of it, was it not? Those who had known him since childhood, who had watched him grow, who saw him day by day, they spoke nothing but good of him. It was only she, a stranger, who had met him but a handful of times, who had heard but one side of the story, who condemned him entirely. And Wickham. She thought of him now, with a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. He had been charming, certainly, open, warm, delightfully agreeable. But had he told her the whole truth? Had he told her anything that could be verified? He had spoken of wrongs and injustices, but had he ever produced a single proof? Had he ever shown her a letter, a document, a witness, anything at all beyond his own word? And why, if Darcy was truly so cruel and unjust, did everyone else who knew him speak so highly of him? Elizabeth walked slowly along the river path, her mind turning over every word, every glance, every moment of their acquaintance. She remembered his silence at the assembly, but perhaps it had been shyness, not pride. She remembered his words about her, but perhaps she had misunderstood or taken them out of context. She remembered his parting from her at Netherfield, his troubled look, his quiet "time will show you the truth." Had he known even then? Had he known that she had been listening to lies, and that one day she would see him as he truly was? She thought of how she had treated him, her sharp words, her accusations, her coldness, her prejudice. She had judged him harshly, unmercifully, without ever giving him the chance to speak. She had listened to a stranger's tale and believed it entirely, while dismissing the testimony of everyone who had known him all his life. And now, seeing him here, in his own home, surrounded by people who loved him, behaving with such grace and humility, she felt a burning sense of shame. If I have been wrong, she thought, then I have been the most foolish, most unjust creature alive. I have been prejudiced, blindly, stubbornly prejudiced, and I have called it judgment. I have been proud of my own discernment, proud of my quick wit, and I have been blind to everything that truly matters. She looked toward the house, half expecting to see him returning. What should she do? How should she behave? If he spoke to her again, if he mentioned their former conversation, or the things she had said, she would scarcely know where to look. She had accused him of cruelty and injustice to his face. She had told him plainly that she knew his true character. And now, she was beginning to realize that she had been mistaken in every particular. Yet still, one doubt remained. What of Wickham? What of his story? Could it be entirely false? Or was there some truth in it, twisted and exaggerated? She did not know. She had no proof either way, only conflicting reports, and her own uncertain judgment. As the afternoon drew on, Darcy returned, accompanied by his sister, Georgiana, a quiet, graceful girl who looked upon Elizabeth with shy curiosity. He introduced them with great kindness, and stood beside them, guiding the conversation, ensuring that everyone felt welcome. Elizabeth watched him, his manner, his patience, his gentle attention to his sister, and with every moment, her conviction grew stronger. She had misjudged him. Deeply, completely misjudged him. When at last they took their leave, Darcy walked with them to their carriage. He spoke to her once more, quietly, respectfully, as though nothing had ever passed between them. And as Elizabeth stepped into the carriage, she glanced back, and found him watching her, his expression earnest, searching, as though he too wondered what she truly thought, and whether she was beginning to understand. On the journey away, Elizabeth sat in thoughtful silence. Her aunt and uncle spoke warmly of Mr. Darcy, praising his manners and his character, but Elizabeth said nothing. She had too much to think. Too much to undo. Too much to learn. And somewhere in her heart, beneath the shame and the confusion, she felt something else, a quiet, unmistakable stirring of feeling, the realization that she had been wrong about him, and that in discovering her mistake, she had begun to see him as he truly was. And seeing him thus, she could no longer deny what her heart was beginning to tell her: she had never disliked him half so much as she had imagined. Chapter 9. The carriage rolled away from Pemberley, carrying Elizabeth and her relatives toward their inn for the night, yet Elizabeth scarcely saw the road before her. Her mind remained behind, in those beautiful grounds, in those stately rooms, with the man she had so thoroughly misjudged. Everything she had once believed was thrown into doubt. Every opinion she had formed, every harsh word she had spoken, every conviction she had held, all now appeared in a new and painful light. She recalled Mrs. Reynolds's praise, steady, sincere, and spoken from long years of observation. She recalled Darcy's own behavior when they had met, his surprise, certainly, but no resentment, no bitterness, no trace of the arrogance she had expected. He had been polite, attentive, respectful, treating her aunt and uncle with genuine consideration, as though their station in life mattered nothing beside their worth as people. This was not the man Wickham had described. This was not the man she had accused to his face. And yet, Wickham's story remained. She could not simply dismiss it entirely. There had been warmth in his manner, sorrow in his voice, a seeming openness that had won her confidence completely. Could he have been so false? Could he have woven such a tale from nothing, and sustained it with such perfect skill? Or was there some truth at its core, some grievance, some misunderstanding, twisted and colored to suit his own purposes? She had no way of knowing. She had heard one version from a charming stranger, and another from those who had known Darcy all his life, and now she must weigh them both fairly. In the days that followed, as they travelled deeper through Derbyshire, Darcy continued to seek her out. He called upon her at every opportunity, not alone, but always in the company of his sister, or attending her aunt and uncle on their walks and excursions. Elizabeth found herself observing him closely, watching how he spoke to everyone, high and low alike, how he watched over his gentle sister with tender devotion, how he listened when others spoke, weighing their words with respect. She saw no arrogance, no disdain, no cold superiority, only quiet dignity, good sense, and genuine kindness. Slowly, painfully, she began to admit the truth to herself. She had been prejudiced, deeply, blindly prejudiced. She had disliked him from the very first moment, on the strength of one careless remark, and from that hour onward she had been determined to see only fault in him. Everything he did had been twisted to confirm her opinion. If he was silent, he was proud. If he spoke little, he was disdainful. If he advised caution, he was cruel. She had judged him not by what he was, but by what she had decided he must be. One afternoon, as they walked together beside a mountain stream, the conversation turned to his departure from Hertfordshire, and to the separation of Mr. Bingley and Jane. Elizabeth hesitated, then spoke plainly. "I have been given to understand," she said, keeping her voice steady, "that you had great influence over Mr. Bingley, and that you used it to persuade him to leave Netherfield, and to forget the lady he admired. Is this true?" Darcy paused, and looked at her gravely. "I did advise him," he confessed. "I told him what I truly believed, that his attachment was not deep, and that the lady's feelings did not seem to be engaged. I believed I was acting for his happiness. I did not know, I could not know, that she loved him as deeply as she does. If I erred in ignorance, not in malice. And I have regretted it bitterly." Elizabeth stood still. "You did not know?" "I did not," he replied earnestly. "I saw her pleasant, I saw her kind, but I never saw proof of deep regard. And when I saw how little encouragement she gave him, I believed he would soon recover. I spoke from what I thought was certainty, but I was mistaken. And I have paid for that mistake with many hours of sorrow, not least because I have seen how deeply it has grieved you." His words struck her to the heart. He had acted from mistaken judgment, not from deliberate cruelty. He had been wrong, terribly wrong, but his motive had been concern for his friend, not malice toward Jane. And she had laid all the blame at his door, seeing only pride and selfishness, never once considering that he might have been honestly mistaken. "There is another matter," she said, her voice trembling now. "Mr. Wickham. He told me." At the name of Wickham, Darcy's expression grew serious. "I know what he told you," he said quietly. "I know the tale he has spread. And I would answer it fully, but not here, not now. Give me but a little time, Miss Elizabeth. I shall lay the whole truth before you, plainly, fully, and with every proof I can produce. And then, and only then, judge me as you see fit." There was such honor in his face, such earnestness in his voice, that Elizabeth could not doubt him. She nodded slowly. "I shall listen. And I shall endeavor to judge fairly." From that moment, a change came over them both. They spoke less of the past, and more of the present, of books, of travel, of the scenery around them, of life and manners. Elizabeth found conversation with him increasingly delightful. He was intelligent, well-read, thoughtful, and beneath his reserve lay a warmth of heart that he showed to few, but that she was beginning to see more clearly with every passing day. She felt herself drawn to him against her will, drawn to his goodness, his integrity, his quiet strength, and she knew, with a strange, sweet fear, that her feelings toward him had changed entirely. Yet even as her heart softened, her old fears returned. If Bingley had been persuaded away from Jane, could he not be persuaded to return? If Darcy had been mistaken once, could he not repair the harm he had done? She dared not ask, but she hoped. And as she looked at him, standing tall and noble beside the rushing water, she began to understand the most painful truth of all. She had fallen in love with him, not despite her former hatred, but because in discovering her own injustice, she had learned to see him as he truly was. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, precious happiness that Elizabeth scarcely dared acknowledge. Darcy was constantly near, attentive, respectful, and yet showing her a confidence and warmth that he offered to no one else. He spoke freely of his life, his responsibilities at Pemberley, his hopes for his sister, and Elizabeth listened, spellbound, seeing more of his character with every word. She learned of his devotion to his tenants, his care for the poor upon his lands, his constant efforts to improve the lives of those around him, all done quietly, without boast or display. And yet, amidst all this growing regard, the shadow of Wickham still hung between them. Elizabeth thought of him often, of his charm, his easy grace, his tale of injustice, and wondered how much of it was true. If Darcy was innocent of all he had been accused of, then what sort of man was Wickham? To invent such falsehoods, to speak with such apparent sorrow, to win her confidence by deception, it was dreadful to contemplate. She did not wish to believe ill of anyone, but every fresh proof of Darcy's integrity made Wickham's story ring more hollow. At last, one evening when they were alone, Darcy handed her a letter, sealed, and written in his own hand. "I promised you the truth," he said quietly. "Everything concerning Mr. Wickham is set down here, plainly, fully, and with dates and facts to support it. Read it when you are alone. Read it carefully. And then, judge me as you find me worthy." Elizabeth took the letter with trembling hands. That night, when all was quiet, she broke the seal and began to read. The letter told a very different story. Darcy wrote that Wickham was the son of his father's steward, a man who had been kindly treated, and whose son had been raised almost as a member of the family. The elder Mr. Darcy had paid for his education, and upon his death, had left him a generous legacy, enough to study a profession and live respectably. But Wickham, upon coming of age, had refused all plans for his future. He had begged for money instead, claiming he wished to study law, but in truth using it for idleness and pleasure. He had spent every penny within months, and then returned to demand more, threatening, insulting, and behaving in the most unprincipled manner. And worse, far worse. Darcy wrote of how Wickham, having exhausted every other means of gaining wealth, had returned to Pemberley and attempted to elope with his young sister, Georgiana, then but 15 years old, intending to carry her off and marry her for her fortune. Georgiana, innocent and trusting, had been persuaded, until Darcy had arrived unexpectedly and discovered the plot. Wickham had fled at once, leaving behind nothing but shame and heartbreak. Elizabeth laid the letter down, her heart pounding and her eyes filled with tears. It was all true, every word of it. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Wickham had told her exactly what he wished her to believe, painting himself as the injured victim, and Darcy as the cruel oppressor. He had known exactly what to say to win her sympathy, and she, foolish, prejudiced, eager to believe the worst of Darcy, had accepted every word without question. She thought of how she had behaved, how she had accused Darcy to his face, how she had despised him, how she had repeated Wickham's lies to others, and she felt overwhelmed by shame. She had been proud, so proud of her own discernment, her quick judgment, her independence of mind. And that very pride had made her blind. She had been prejudiced, blindly, stubbornly prejudiced, and she had mistaken that prejudice for wisdom. Until this moment, she whispered to herself, "I never knew myself." Darcy had been right all along. He had warned her, he had told her there were two sides to every story. And she had chosen the wrong one, simply because it flattered her own opinion and fed her dislike. She finished the letter, folded it carefully, and sat long into the night, thinking over everything. She saw now that her prejudice had been as great a fault as his pride, and perhaps greater. He had been silent, distant, and reserved, but he had never been false. She had been quick to judge, hasty to condemn, and entirely unjust, and all because she had allowed her own temper to cloud her understanding. When morning came, Elizabeth rose with a heavy heart but a clear mind. She knew the truth now, all of it. Wickham was unworthy of her regard. Darcy, noble, generous, honourable Darcy, had been maligned, misunderstood, and cruelly judged. And she had been the instrument of that injustice. She walked out into the garden and found him waiting beneath the trees. He looked at her and saw the sorrow in her face, and at once his expression softened, filled with gentle compassion rather than triumph. "You have read it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I have," she replied, her voice low. "And I have nothing to say for myself. I have been blind, foolish, unjust, and blind. You have every right to despise me." He stepped closer, his eyes filled with earnest feeling. "Despise you? I have never admired you more. Because you have the courage to see your own fault, and the honesty to acknowledge it. That is greatness of spirit, Miss Elizabeth, far greater than any pride or fortune could bestow." Elizabeth looked up at him, tears in her eyes, and in that moment, everything changed. The misunderstanding was ended. The truth was known. And standing there together in the morning light, they both understood the past was gone, and something new and precious had begun. Chapter 10. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, tender understanding that neither seemed in any haste to name. Elizabeth walked with Darcy, conversed with him, and saw in every word and action further proof of his goodness, his integrity, and the depth of his regard. She had once thought him the proudest man alive, and now she understood that what she had mistaken for pride was in part natural reserve, in part a knowledge of the world that had taught him caution, and in part the weight of great responsibilities born from youth. His silence had not been scorn, but reflection. His distance had not been arrogance, but a heart slow to trust and slow to show itself. He told her that he had struggled against his feelings for her, that he had fought against the strength of his attachment, believing her family unsuitable and their connections a disadvantage. He admitted that he had been proud, deeply so, and that his pride had been humbled by the discovery that she, whom he had learned to admire above all others, looked upon him with nothing but dislike. He spoke of the pain of that realization, and of how her anger had opened his eyes to his own faults, teaching him that true worth is not measured by rank or fortune, but by character, kindness, and goodness. Elizabeth listened, tears in her eyes, and confessed in turn all her own mistakes, her prejudice, her hasty judgment, her blind belief in Wickham's falsehoods, and the injustice with which she had treated him from the very beginning. She told him how ashamed she was, and how deeply she regretted every harsh word. And he, instead of triumphing or reproaching her, told her that her honesty and courage were the very qualities he had always most admired in her, that her spirit had drawn him to her from the first moment they met, and that even when she spoke against him most bitterly, he had found himself unable to tear his heart away. They spoke, too, of Jane and Bingley. Elizabeth told him of her sister's quiet grief, and of how she still loved him truly. Darcy listened gravely, and promised that the wrong should be set right. He wrote at once to Bingley, explaining all that had passed, confessing his own error, and urging him to return to Netherfield without delay, to see Jane, to speak with her, and to learn the truth of her feelings for himself. He did this freely, gladly, accepting full responsibility for the pain he had caused, and doing everything in his power to heal the wound he had unwittingly helped to make. When the time came for Elizabeth to depart from Derbyshire, they parted with great reluctance. He did not press her for an answer, nor demand her promise, knowing that she must return home, and that there were matters to be settled and hearts to be prepared. He merely asked that she would think of him, and that she would remember that his happiness was entirely in her hands. Elizabeth promised that she would, and as she travelled away, her heart full and her mind at peace, she knew that whatever the future might bring, she had found in him all that was noble, all that was true, and all that she could ever desire. Upon her return to Longbourn, Elizabeth found Jane pale and thoughtful, still watching the road, still hoping against hope. Elizabeth told her nothing at first, waiting to see whether Darcy's letter would take effect. And scarcely had a week passed before a carriage arrived at Longbourn, and Mr. Bingley stepped down. He came straight to Jane, spoke to her with earnest devotion, and confessed his deep and lasting love. He told her of his regret, of his blindness, and of how he had been persuaded away from her, and then, seeing her gentle heart still open to him, he poured out all his affection, and asked her to be his wife. Jane accepted him with tears of joy, and so, at last, true affection was rewarded, and happiness restored. In the days that followed, Elizabeth found herself thinking constantly of Darcy. She wondered whether he would come, whether he still felt as he had done in Derbyshire, whether she dared hope that he might love her still. And then, one morning, she saw him walking up the drive. He came to her, alone, and spoke plainly of his feelings, of how he had loved her almost against his will, of how her dislike had wounded him, and of how her courage and honesty had at last won his heart entirely. He asked her to marry him, not as a favor, not as an advantageous match, but because he respected her, admired her, and loved her with all his soul. Elizabeth wept, and told him that she loved him too, that she had learned to see him as he truly was, and that in doing so, she had learned to love him beyond measure. She told him that his pride had been conquered by her prejudice, and that together they had cast both aside, learning to see each other clearly, and to value what truly mattered. And so, hand in hand, they agreed to spend their lives together, two people who had begun by disliking one another, who had judged each other falsely, and who had learned through patience, honesty, and humility to love each other truly. They were married not long afterward, Jane to Mr. Bingley, and Elizabeth to Mr. Darcy, and both were happy beyond measure. Elizabeth went to Pemberley as its mistress, beloved by all who lived there, respected by those who had known her husband from childhood, and cherished deeply by the man who had once been so proud, and who had learned at last that happiness is not found in rank or fortune, but in the heart of the one you love. And as for Wickham, his true character was soon revealed, and he lived a life of empty pleasure and regret, a warning to all that charm without integrity is hollow, and that falsehoods, however persuasive, will always be found out in the end. And so the story closes, with two hearts united, two faults corrected, and two people who learned that pride may be humbled, prejudice may be overcome, and true love may grow from the most unlikely of beginnings. Pride and Prejudice, retold. Based on the original work by Jane Austen. Thank you for spending this quiet time in the sleepy universe. If you're still awake, feel free to stay and drift a little deeper. Until next time, sleep well, rest deeply, and take care.